why is the Wagner group so why were they so popular in Rostov? Like if like why were they so popular in Rostov?
I think that's the never-ending question. It's like, why is this group so popular? But also, I mean, it's not just Rostov. In social media, people were, like, oh yeah, Prigozhin's gonna go fight Putin. I'm like, Prigozhin is a monster.
Oh yeah, he
And
seems worse than that. Like that would be. I mean, as far as I mean, like a billionaire in charge of mercenary. Like the idea of like Eric Prince, getting like that's not necessarily an upgrade from Trump. In that, I mean, Prince was, very involved in that administration. Like I wouldn't want a mercenary to have control over the nukes. And particularly anybody who comes to power in that way. But I want to talk about the implications of it. But yeah, no, I think people could cheer some measure of chaos, I guess. But good things don't always come out of chaos.
oh, I mean, particularly studying Russian history, good things rarely come out of chaos. And we saw when you see the videos and Rostov, I think it's also the way that they come in. I mean, they aren't really bullying civilians around. And a lot of Russians just like looking around like, oh, this is what's happening now. Okay. But those who support Wagner, I think it's because they see Wagner as the only part of the Russian military effort in Ukraine that's been really successful. So I think they've identified that Russian military success with Wagner, and Prigozhin's been very good at his messaging about the importance of Wagner to any type of Russian military success. But also the people in Rostov, they're getting the news from Ukraine, and they're getting the news from the Russian state. They're seeing how poorly Russia has been performing. So I think that's the key thing is being able to take a place that's very close to what's going on, people who know how poorly things are going, but also treating the civilians. He's not being really violent towards them. You see like Wagner guys getting coffee, going to the liquor store. It's really bizarre when you think about it. So I think those are some of the keys. But also I think a lot of the Russian people, particularly those on the border with Ukraine, they're tired. I mean, it's combat fatigue, not knowing how safe you are, not knowing if missiles are going to fly, if there's going to be an errant missile that hits the town. So I think all those kind of come together into the personality that is Prigozhin. I mean,
And
the man's, he's very, you watch his videos and you're like, is this what, like John Belushi could have played him in a documentary if he had just shaved his head, right? So he's very popular. He's very energetic compared to how Putin comes off.
I would imagine mercenaries coming to town too, if they've been told, behave well, they probably have more cash to spend than your regular army. And then
Yes.
all of a sudden it's almost like, oh, this guy's bringing in the
It's
tourism.
like when the mob comes to town and buys a bunch of, hands out money or shoes or whatever.
I mean, I would imagine they come in, and they pay for everything, and particularly when they know that's the situation. All right, so what does this like? A lot of people are making like there was no resistance coming from there, and it's hard to tell whether that was on purpose, like the Russian military said, like don't engage in this because the only way to control it is to not engage in it in some type of way. But what are the implications? What does it tell us about what's going on right now in Russia? But what does it say in terms of like, does this create a narrative that Putin is weak? Does this create a narrative that the war is going worse than we in Russia thought it was? Like, I don't have a sense of like what the existing narrative was as to whether it was changing. I mean, do you have a sense of those things as to like what it, assuming, Prigozhin stays in Belarus and his family doesn't get killed, he doesn't get killed, he just stays there, and I don't know, he keeps paying his mercenaries to just sort of hang out. Like, I'm not quite clear on what happens to them. But what does it mean for internal Russian politics?
So it's a good question. And the weird thing was how quiet Putin was for a long time. And a lot of people read into that. And I'm like, also remember Stalin disappeared when the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union. And look at how he came out at the end of World War II, right? The most beloved leader. So I think a lot of people are playing mum. They're following the state narrative. Margarita Simonyan, like the big, propaganda expert and propaganda supporter of the Russian state media. She's been like, things are legal, and then sometimes the laws change depending on the situation. So people are playing pretty mum. But I don't think it's showing this internal crisis that people are predicting. I mean, there is a reason why Prigozhin stopped hundreds of kilometers outside of Moscow. Despite the popularity of Wagner in Rostov-on-Don, we did see fighting in Voronezh. They did have military preparedness in Moscow. You saw multiple cities across Russia prepare with Operation Fortress for any type of attack. And I think the key is, so Prigozhin goes to Belarus. If he continues to lead Wagner and Wagner shows a good, strength in Ukraine, he can survive this. I don't think it's going to be time for Swan Lake to start playing on Russian state television. And I think that when you see a lot of these narratives in the West, that this is the end of Putin, we're going to a civil war, I don't think it's based in what we're seeing on the ground. I think it's based on our imaginations of what people want to happen. But in terms of Russian politics, Moscow was chill yesterday. People are out shopping, doing the thing. And we don't know how much of this information has been spread across Russia from Telegram channels and state media. They're playing it very cool. So most Russians aren't thinking this is a dire situation. It's like, oh, Prigozhin showed out and now he's in Belarus. We're still fighting. That doesn't necessarily mean, we're in a situation where Putin's trying to leave Russia and never come back again. So they have to be very careful about predicting civil war and things like that, when he really could just keep Prigozhin in Belarus and keep fighting the war in Ukraine.
And to be clear, those Wagner fighters are going to end up back in Ukraine, fighting where, Putin or, et al. Basically say, we need your guys down here. And I would imagine if I'm Prigozhin, I'm nervous. Maybe not right now. Well, I'm nervous, but I'm really nervous about sending big parts of my mercenary army to be led by somebody else in Ukraine, because that's the guy who's going to replace me. That's the guy who makes me dispensable. And I'd be very nervous about that.
Precisely. If I'm Prigozhin, I'm popping Tums every 10 hours, every 10 minutes, because I have heartburn. But I think this is the cost. He's not going to be dead. I think you're going to be strung along. You don't know when you're going to be replaced. You don't know when you're going to be poisoned or if you're going to be poisoned. But I think if we look outside of the Wagner troops going back to Ukraine, how are the Wagner troops posted in Africa behaving? How are they responding to this news? And that's what I've been trying to figure out, is how are they working? Because they control massive land, like diamond mines throughout Central African Republic. They're also protecting a lot of Russian infrastructure throughout sub-Saharan Africa and Northern Africa. So the question becomes, will there be a person who shows up for Wagner that can replace Prigozhin? Or do you just count on his lieutenants carrying out what needs to be done in order to keep him safe in Belarus? So it depends on his relationships with these lieutenants that he has, but also those lieutenants have families too.
Yeah.
What is
I would, if I was him, I would appoint the worst lieutenant I got to lead my mercenaries in battle in Ukraine, and just be like, something about me.
But he's bloodthirsty, right? I mean, he's ideologically we need to be going even harder in Ukraine, being even more brutal, and that I think is why one, it was so short-sighted to see certain people cheering this on. I mean, but at the same time, what is the state of the anti-war left in Russia right now? Because that may be why the fracture was overstated, because this clearly wasn't somebody who was trying to topple Putin in opposition to the war in Ukraine.
Absolutely. That is such a good point. And this is what I was trying to talk about on Twitter when people were saying, oh, this is going to be good for the war in Ukraine. I was like, if you listen to what Prigozhin is saying, he's mad that they haven't been more brutal, that they haven't killed more Ukrainians, that they haven't taken more Ukrainian land. That's what he's angry about, is how little Russia's been able to accomplish in the past year in Ukraine. So if he had been successful, if Prigozhin was able to get Shoigu kicked out, to get Gerasimov, fired, who would have replaced them? And what would have been those aims? So I think that's something important to remember, is, if anything, if he wants to show his loyalty to Putin, and he wants to show why you can't dissolve Wagner, why they need to operate separately for the Ministry of Defense, the only way you show that is with being successful in Ukraine. And being successful in Ukraine, if you're Wagner, is taking as much territory as you can and being as brutal as you can.
What happens to Shoigu and Gerasimov? I feel like, I mean, at one point, and again, it would be hard for me to be watching anything play out and know less as what was going on. But it occurred to me in terms of like how everybody expected Putin to react and not, that it was almost felt like, and I doubt this is the case in retrospect, but it almost felt like Putin, it's almost like when Trump would have somebody else go and fire somebody for him. Like that Putin was using Prigozhin as a way of firing somebody or getting it, so that he didn't have to. Because I imagine that if you're Shoigu and Gerasimov, you've got your own constituencies and your own bases of power within the Russian military bureaucracy. And for you to be summarily, fired could create some backlash within those constituencies. But if there is an obvious, like, they lost face, I mean, this, a fighting force of 25,000 or less just sort of marched through and made mincemeat of them, then it's easier to get rid of those guys if you feel like they've been failing.
Precisely. And I think the key part is thinking about the different constituencies. And when you study like Stalinism and how Stalin maintained power, it was people having those different constituencies that would keep you in check. It would be able to save you. After Stalin dies, you see, the Politburo get rid of Beria because he doesn't have as many constituencies that they have to deal with as other people. And so Shoigu, Gerasimov, when we think about why they stayed in the positions they have, despite Russian military setbacks, it's also their positioning within the Kremlin, their supporters in the Kremlin, but also Putin must believe in them. That has to be one of the reasons why he sticks around. He keeps them around, but also this idea that Putin and Prigozhin have been best buddies, like that's not the case. I don't think Putin's ever truly trusted Prigozhin. And so keeping Gerasimov and Shoigu around, they keeps their constituencies happy, but also you need to have those state-based power centers to deal with something like Wagner. I don't know how long Wagner can continue to exist. And I was surprised that it got this big and this powerful under Putin, because one of the reasons why he's kept the Russian military weak for so long is because it could be an alternative center of power. And so now you have this mercenary group that is an alternative center of power.
Well, Kimberly St. Julian-Varnon, thank you so much for your time today. Hopefully we will see you sooner than the last time. And as things continue, I mean, sadly, it feels like this is going to go on for quite some time. But really appreciate your coming on and sort of explaining, to the extent that we could know what is going on there, what has been going on. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.